Hi, welcome to Taking Stock number 80. Rudyard Kipling, the Nobel Prize-winning author, was what you might call the principal poet of arch-imperialism. Not only did he write the Jungle Book stories and the Just So stories, mostly for children, but he also wrote verse in what he fondly imagined was the military vernacular. And maybe it was, for all I know. I do know it sounds strange to the ears of modern people, not only because of the vocabulary or presumed accent of the poem's narrators. It's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away, but it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the bands begin to play. Well, yeah, perhaps. But it's also a bit strange because despite their faint iconoclasm, there's still an air of Victorian deference about them which doesn't sit well with us in the 21st century. Not as much as others of his ilk, though. How about, but it's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote, play up, and play the game, wrote Sir Henry Newbolt, probably not in that accent because he was born in Bilston, one of Kipling's contemporaries, and thus poeticised and epitomised the drive to encourage thousands of earnest young men to fling themselves forward through mud and hails of bullets for 4 years in Flanders fields. I grew up in the 1960s, just as the tenor of the times were a-changing, as Bob Dylan put it. Then, gaudy Edwardian uniforms were worn ironically as part of the psychedelic culture of the times. Violent protests against the American war in Vietnam were taking place all across the United States and in Europe, including infamously in Grosvenor Square in London. The musical Oh What a Lovely War was a huge success and was seen as an anti-war satire. I'm not entirely sure the writers would agree, necessarily. Books and articles were written, and are still written, about both the major conflicts of the 20th century, and dramas and films are written and performed, all of which present these conflicts through the filter of late 20th and 21st century concepts and understandings. In dramatic terms, for example, conventional wisdom about World War I was almost baked into the public consciousness by the production of the admittedly magnificent final Blackadder series, Blackadder Goes Forth, in 1989. So now we all presume that not only was the First World War a wholly avoidable, futile dynastic conflict between three cousins magnified out of all proportion, but that interpretation of events was widely recognised at the time at all levels of society throughout Europe, and that millions of men were forced into taking part in the meat grinder of the Western Front. In fact, as my friend Dr. Stuart Bell points out in his PhD thesis, given the chance, this was far from the case. Most people, or at least at the beginning, and groomed if you like by the likes of Kipling and Newbolt, saw participation in the war as their moral and even their religious duty. Hundreds of thousands of men volunteered for service. It's easy to forget that for the majority of the war, all armed forces personnel were volunteers, not conscripts. Conscription didn't come into force until 1917, 1 year before the war's end. Most churchmen acted as religious recruiting sergeants, including Methodist ministers. Conscientious objectors and other anti-war campaigners were relatively few and far between, actually. When asked about war poets these days, most of us can quote the names, and some of us the verse, of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. Not so much Rupert Brooke. If we are Welsh, we quote Hedd Wyn, who died on the Western Front in 1917, shortly after winning the chair of poetry at the National Eisteddfod. We know about the tragedy, but we forget something. We forget that whilst the bravado of most of the soldiers did not survive first contact with the enemy any more than their generals' plans did, nonetheless for many the bravery did. We forget that whilst many villages and whole neighbourhoods in many major northern cities all mourned on the same day as the telegrams from the War Office relayed the simultaneous loss of Powell's battalions, so also swelled the sense of pride amidst great loss, and often so hardened the resolve to endure and to win. For the vast majority of ordinary people like you and me, the idea of questioning that sense of duty in the midst of the conflict would have felt like a monstrous betrayal of those who'd gone to fight and to die if necessary for, as they saw it, king and country. They believed they were doing the right thing. 100 years later, we may pride ourselves on being streetwise or canny or even cynical, but the evidence shows that we're not that much different in essence to our forebears. We too, for all our belief that we are rugged individualists, are just as much products of our upbringing, of our societal conditioning, of our education or lack of it, as our grandparents and great-grandparents were. Had we, who are male, been contemporaries of our ancestors, then for the most part, the vast majority of us would have been skipping fresh-faced, laughing and joking down to the recruiting office with the rest of them in August 1914. It's only with the luxury of hindsight that historians are able to judge the tide of events, and even so, few dare to second guess, except in the most general of ways, the subjects of their study, except perhaps in the most limited and specific of ways. So history will also judge us, but that isn't for us to second guess either. Many of us in the church have been speculating as to the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on our various churches and denominations. For some, the pandemic is an unmitigated disaster because many churches have closed their buildings for worship and will not open again, even post-pandemic. For others, the pandemic has merely precipitated what was widely recognised as being inevitable. The age demographic of every denomination in the Western world has been steadily increasing for a number of decades. And the decline in attendance of church amongst Generation X and millennials has been acute and steep. And in the eyes of many, a pandemic was bound to accelerate that decline. Still others see the pandemic as an opportunity in the last year, and one we've all come on in leaps and bounds in our grasp of technology and have progressed in developing online outreach in ways we'd almost never have dreamed possible 18 months ago. No one would wish the COVID-19 virus on anyone, still less upon the whole human race, but there's no denying that as churches we've been forced to accelerate our learning process, if only in order to be able to communicate with each other. But in the process we have reached many, many more people who may have previously felt excluded from exploring their own faith and spirituality by what I think of as the terror of the threshold. People who would never consider stepping inside our buildings, or through personal circumstances have been unable to do so, are participating in online events laid on by churches and discovering a new or renewed faith. Suddenly, the church community, in the midst of adversity, loneliness and lockdown, has value again. It can connect people with one another. It can offer solace and comfort and companionship. It can once more reach out to the community from within the community. I cannot see into the future, I'm glad to say. Although I'm sure history will judge us as a nation for how we've reacted to and dealt with the pandemic, maybe is already judging us from the perspective of a mere 12 months since it began. I have no idea how those to whom we hand the torch of faith will look upon the contemporary church. Will we be hailed as heroes for facing what we see to be the truth about our situation as church communities and seizing what we see as the opportunity for pruning and growth? Or are we to be judged as villains who brought down the church of God by abandoning precious building assets in search of the chimera of relevance? Well, I don't know. But Kipling's words, I hope that we as church communities meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. I diverge from Kipling, however, in that I hope that we treat them the same in this way, that we give over to the God who cares for each and every one of us, every triumph and every disaster. For what we are and who we are may well be lost to history when our voices are silent and our bodies return to the dust from which they were made. But to the God who knows who we are, who knows our motivations and our strengths and our weaknesses, we are ever alive. And we who believe, well, we know who will meet us in a future we cannot see. Stay safe, people.